Okay, good morning, everybody. The first message is, as I've already said, our order of the day today will be Angelina Ireland will be speaking first, and then Catherine Foster, and then myself. We are taking a break at about the hour-and-a-half point at about 10:30, depending. It might be a few minutes different, but so everyone will know you can take a short break at that point. You might be wondering why we chose Victoria, BC. Now, obviously online. As I said, we had over 300 people register online. I'm not sure how many obviously show up. That's the thing with the online. But nonetheless, the reason we chose Victoria, BC is because this happens to be the killing capital of the world. There are more euthanasia deaths percentage-wise than any other place in the world. This is the death capital. Whether, it's such a nice place to come. It's a beautiful place. With the environment and the water and everything. It's a beautiful place, but it is by far in 2021, the data showed that on Vancouver Island, over 10% of all deaths were by euthanasia, by MAID. We don't have the 2022 data, but if you have been following my ratings, you'll notice that the data shows that in almost every jurisdiction, the increase was between 30 and 40% in 2022. So that's another question. Yesterday, myself and Angelina and Catherine did a little get together by the Ministry of Health, and the one thing I mentioned was what is the Ministry of Health in British Columbia hiding? Now, why did I ask the question? Because Ontario and British Columbia, Nova Scotia, Manitoba, they all released their data on MAID. We're not talking about individual data, so I have no idea who died. And nor should I have any idea who died, because obviously, this is issues of privacy, and I understand that. The British Columbia government doesn't release the data. We don't know any of the data from British Columbia for 2022, and we have all the data from Ontario for 2022. So that's sort of an important point. But on top of it, the fact of it is that they're doing a major push in British Columbia, Victoria, etc., to have more and more euthanasia. And so this is very much of our concern. So our first speaker today is going to be Angelina Ireland. And many of you know her because she's the president of the Delta Hospice Society. And Angelina, I don't think had any goal or intention of becoming a national figure. What happened is that the Delta Hospice Society decided that they would not be doing euthanasia. They will not do it. They will not participate in it. They will not do it. And in turn, the Fraser Health and the British Columbia government defunded them and decided to expropriate their property. And all of that because they refused to do the killing. And so that's very important. So Angelina has become a Canadian leader on this issue simply by the fact that she refused for the Delta Hospice Society in any way to participate in euthanasia. And I think that's phenomenal. And so I'm going to introduce Angelina first, and I'm going to open up her PowerPoint and make sure it's working. And you'll be able to follow her PowerPoint with her presentation.
So first of all, thank you very much for making the trek out here in person this morning. And I thank all of our good friends and supporters online for joining us here this morning. I want everyone to understand that you are part of the greatest human rights movement of all time. And this is the fight for human life. So I thank you for your bravery. Thank you for showing up, and I thank you for your support. Yes, my name is Angelina Ireland. I am not a doctor. I have never been trained in public speaking. I'm not a lobbyist. The only thing that I ever have been is a patient. I therefore speak for patients. I am a cancer survivor. I have been through the system. I have been through surgeries, chemotherapy, radiation, a year of adjuvant therapy every week. And thanks be to God, I am able to stand in front of you today and in the past few years and speak on this issue that That truly concerns me. In fact, I have pretty much devoted my life to this issue the last few years. as we see what is happening to our beloved country, to our citizens. And it's something that literally keeps me up at night now, and ways in which that, we can try to do something to protect each other. So the Delta Hospice Society, as I came to be involved with them, I came as a patient to the society when I was going through my cancer journey. And it was because of the kinds of programming that they offered that my friends and I, we called ourselves the Cancer Club. We would go, every week to the Delta Hospice Society. And some of my friends recovered, as did I, to good health. But some of my friends passed away in the hospice. So I have, this is a topic that is truly close to my heart. It's very personal to me. So the Delta Hospice Society, when I got back to health, I thought I need to give back to this organization. So I became part of the board of directors. That was many years ago now. And as things just sort of ramped up in this country, I just became more and more involved and on the board until I became the president in 2019. So the Delta Hospice Society itself is a 30-year organization devoted to palliative care. And sometimes people don't understand what exactly palliative care is. It is a truly noble medical discipline that is devoted to caring for people. So not only their physical comfort, and it's very important, obviously, because pain management and symptom management is one of the main ways we can live well when we're not well. And this includes having people which are experts in pain management, all kinds of different kinds of cocktails and things that you can give to people so that they feel better. And that is actually a profession itself, which people are trained to be part of. So they have to have extra training to be involved in palliative care. But it goes far beyond that. It's a very holistic approach to care for people. So it's not just the physical, it's not just the meds, right? It's about psychological support that, because being unwell and sort of facing your mortality, brings up a lot of distress, emotions. And so palliative care is something that sort of walks in to help alleviate that, as well as having a lot to do with spiritual support, because we have a lot of questions in that time of our, what are we doing here? Is there a God? Well, why am I going through this? So, that's another very important aspect of healing and of health. And palliative care then becomes something that includes every aspect of the human person. What palliative care does not include is euthanasia. It does not include MAID. It is not a tool in the toolbox of palliative care. And this is a position that has been held from the beginning of this 50-year medical discipline. It is something that is held by all palliative care organizations in the world, including our own palliative care doctors and nurses that we've trained here in Canada. So this 50-year medical discipline basically became institutionalized with a lady named Dame Cicely Saunders in England. And basically she brought what was always a vocation of people of faith to take care of the sick and the dying. And she brought that into the institution, into hospitals and into care units. And she is the mother of the modern hospice movement. And here in Canada, we have a very important role in this because one of our very own, Dr. Balfour Mount, is considered to be the father of palliative care medicine. And he spent all of his career promoting, creating palliative care programs. He started in McGill University in the hospital there and sort of brought this whole idea of palliative care into the mainstream. And he says for over 4 decades, palliative care has been providing expert medical management to assist and support those who are dying without hastening death or administering lethal doses of drugs. So we know very well, and we know from our own discipline that euthanasia is not part of that. coercive makeover of what palliative care has always been came to Canada through the May legislation. So out of this hospice and palliative care movement came the hospice itself, right? And we always considered that a hospice is a place where people come to live and not just simply to die, right? That with the little time that they have left, it's a place of celebration and connection, comfort, and support. And that has been our mission, our motto from the beginning of the Delta Hospice Society. And back when we started, and certainly when we started collecting money and private funds to create a hospice, the government of British Columbia was very happy. They were very happy that private citizens would go out and take this initiative upon themselves and create a facility. And back in 2010, the province of British Columbia, the Fraser Health Authority, ecstatic, partners with us, and everybody was so happy. And we did. We built a beautiful hospice, a flagship facility to service not only people in our community, but people around the Lower Mainland who could sort of get in to the 10 beds that we offered. And that's a picture of it, a truly beautiful place. You walk in and it's very open. We had our own chef to make good food for people and for their families that would come, and places to sit and to visit, special quiet rooms that people could have privacy. And this was a room, one of the hospice rooms. And each one had a private patio. You could go out and sit in the garden. And this was right next to it. We had a 7,500 square foot supportive care center, which is one of the places that I went to that provided the programming for people who were on their cancer journeys or other, illnesses that were chronic, and also programs for people's families and bereavement counseling. Back in 2016, like with a stretch of a pen, legislation happened and it changed everything that we know this country to be. And basically it burned the book on what palliative care was. And it sort of decided it was going to be revised, because we're just dinosaurs. But in the process of doing that, becoming modern and progressive, we have literally destroyed a national treasure. And people, highly trained palliative care professionals, have basically been turned into party planners. The end of life party, and then they basically just kill the person, at the end of that, and it's beautiful and wonderful. And basically, these people have become executioners, as opposed to people who should be taking care of, their fellow citizens, their people until their natural end. So medical assistance in dying, it started 2016. I don't need to go into the details. I'm sure most of you understand what it is, what it tried to do. It started by, just helping those who were suffering. Of course, we reject that. Anybody needs to suffer if they're properly cared for. But this is how it came in, and because we refuse to kill people, well, we're just the monsters. When in fact, what we have provided to people over the years has been the greatest thing that you can do for your fellow human being. So now, we're facing a situation which my colleagues will speak about later, where it doesn't take much to be approved for MAID. I love to call it MAID because it sounds nice. It doesn't take much for people to be approved for euthanasia. You pretty much having a bad time of things, and that encompasses, I would suggest most of us in this particular day and age, after years of lockdown and mandates and an economy and inflation, so on and so forth. Like we're all sort of suffering from PTSD. So the law for MAID basically says that you're allowed access, that the criminal code is they're not going to prosecute doctors and nurses who help people to kill themselves. That's the law. But because healthcare is a provincial jurisdiction, according to our constitution, that is now pushed down onto the provinces to facilitate that new right. But when you come to British Columbia, what we found was this alacrity, this enthusiasm for embracing euthanasia and bringing it to the people. And so this is not the law. The law says access. What this is government policy. Now, where we were situated, we had leased a little bit of land next to the Delta Hospital. And on that land, we had a 35-year land lease, a 35-year lease that was registered in the land titles office. And you could literally see the hospital right from our window because we were right next to it. And at that hospital, you could have MAID if you wanted. So there was no lack of access. And it was literally like a minute away because here's the map, right? You can see it. But you see, that wasn't enough for the government because euthanasia has become the king of all procedures in British Columbia. Every publicly funded bed, which is all of them, must provide death. Now we have a hospital sitting there in Delta, but you can't have your baby there because they don't have a maternity ward. So you have to take yourself and go to some other city to have your baby, right? Vancouver or maybe Surrey, wherever you can get in. But not this hospital. However, in this hospital, anybody who wants to come and get mated, you must allow it. And so when it came to us, a private organization involved in a private-public partnership because we got a contract with the government for $1.5 million a year in which they would sort of funded the operation of that hospice. Now the society put in a lot of money as well because clearly that wasn't enough to operate everything that we did. So the problem was, of course, that we refused to kill our patients because euthanasia is not part of palliative care. And we stood on an authentic definition of our medical discipline. So this did, as you can imagine, this didn't go over very well. And we were threatened that if you don't start providing MAID in your facility, you're going to lose it. Well, at first we didn't really think that that would be possible. But then we saw the dominoes fall. Over about 2 years, every hospital, every hospice, every long-term care facility was providing euthanasia. And we were standing out there like the solitary person out. And so it became pretty easy for them to get rid of us because we were the last one standing, refusing to participate in killing our patients. And when we did that, we were faced with, I just call it an angry mob. We were vilified, we were threatened, we were defunded, we were taken to court, we were attacked, even on a personal level, even myself personally, because we refused to kill our patients. This is one of my favorite, because you see on social media, for example, they found me there. Well, I had to get off. I'm not on any kind of social media, no Facebook, no Twitter, no whatever, just because I was chased out, because I was literally canceled. They egged my house. They banged in the middle of the night on my house door for about 6 months. They everywhere on social media, they demonized me and vilified me. But you know, I understood that when I decided that we were not going to, and then I took all the arrows and the bullets for that position, which is fine. That's an honor for me. I must say that. Please don't let me think I'm complaining. I'm not. But that just goes to show that the social pressure that everybody was under to participate in killing is overwhelming. So we've had here that every level of government came after us, municipal, provincial, federal, because we were We were just naughty. We were bad. We were not complying. And here, you'll see they're all nicely standing apart. You know, they're socially distancing, because this was in the middle of COVID, when COVID first hit us in 2020. And they had to have a special meeting. This meeting was just to discuss the Delta Hospice Society. So we have the mayor of Delta, the 2 MLAs, 1 NDP, 1 BC Liberal or Unity, whatever they're calling themselves these days. And the Fed there, Carla, federal Liberal cabinet minister, they all had to get together to decide what to do about us. And so the pressure was from everyone. So then we started getting letters, of course, from Fraser Health Authority. We're going to cancel your contract. We're going to evict you. On and on it went for months, until finally they got the gumption, they got the support to take our hospice away from us. They cut our service agreement, and then they went after our lease. Now, I told you that we had a 35-year lease with 25 years left, and they canceled it, and they evicted us, and they took our hospice that we had privately fundraised for, $8.5 million, and they took it from us, and they kicked us out. What we were left with as an organization was a property. So those are our assets now. We have a property. We have, in which we operate a thrift store. That's one of our revenue streams, okay? So now the property became the focus of the attack. And so a group of pro-maters started coming after us to basically take over the organization and overthrow the board of directors, particularly myself. And then they would bring in MAID, and they take the organization and they take the assets, about $4 million worth, and that would be the end of us forever. However, it didn't quite work out that way, because there are good people in this country. There are people that care about citizens and care about each other. And we became a national organization. We went out to everybody in this country and asked them to become a member of the Delta Hospice Society for $10. And when the AGM came, there was 2 slates. There was the pro-life, and then there was I call them the death squad. I don't think they appreciate that. And that was basically the showdown. And we won. We won. And I thank you, every one of you who became a member, who came to those 2 meetings that were disasters. Right? And we won with by 75% to protect our organization, to reject MAID and euthanasia, and to stand as a truly palliative care organization. So we won that battle. But now we stand back with a lot of experience with government agencies, with advocates, with national lobby groups that came against us. Dying with Dignity Canada particularly came against us. They're a huge, well-funded, the government even gives them money, millions of dollars. We didn't give us anything, right, to fight and lobby for euthanasia in this country. They came after us. They knew that they had to silence us, because you can't, that little organization with that crazy president, you got to shut them up, because they can cause problems, right? But they did not. They were not able to do that. But now here we are, and we see what's happening after all of this is over, and we see that brave people now speaking out about what's happening to them, what's happening to their loved ones when they get into the healthcare system. And one whistleblower came forward and said, well, this is a man of faith. This is a pro-life man and his wife. However, she was mated. How does something like that happen? And he determined that gravely wounded, demented, or elderly people are at risk of euthanasia in this BC health system. Those are not my words. Those are his words after he lost his wife. So now, as we go forward into the future, knowing where we're walking along in this political landscape, we know that we must protect each other. That we must speak not for those who want to have MAID, but for those who do not. And quite frankly, the last bit of stats talks about who wants MAID. Well, I'm a minority. The vast majority of Canadians want palliative care. They want to be taken care of. They want their family to be taken care of during that process. And they want to live well until their natural end. That's what it means to be Canadian. That's what we believe. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we are committed to providing innovative resources that promote authentic palliative care for those dealing with end-of-life circumstances. Now, palliative care is not just the last few minutes of someone's life, like the BC government wants it to become now. Oh, you can only have palliative care after 3 months out of death, that's it. No. Palliative care has no timeline. It is whenever a person is facing a chronic illness that is potentially life-threatening, that's when palliative care kicks in. So we took some good examples from the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. They started with the life supporting advanced directive, and we said we're going to do that too. We're going to make one for every single province in Canada. So we went to a lawyer. We said, make us an advanced directive that says I will not be euthanized. Make it legal, get people to sign it, and let them bring it with them everywhere they go. And let the administration know when they walk in that don't be trying to bother me with any of your MAID nonsense talk. Because one of the first things they do when someone is unwell is they say, oh, we have the solution for you. It's like they got the panacea to everybody's problem now. You just kill yourself. Perfect. No. So you bring this with you, the Do Not Euthanize Advanced Directive. It's a legal document. You sign it, have 2 witnesses sign it, and it is free. In fact, I brought a whole pile for everybody in this room today, and you can have it. And if you're online, just we have a website, deltahospicesociety.org. You go on there and you just request one, and we'll send it to you by email. But of course, you ought to tell us what province you live in so we can send you the right one. But this isn't enough, because we now know from circumstantial evidence, people that call us, and even from personal experiences now, that you don't walk into the healthcare system by yourself, okay? We need a buddy system now. You don't walk in by yourself because you need to have somebody who will advocate and protect you when you cannot do that for yourself. So we are starting a program called Guardian Angels. And this is to ensure that since the government is adamant that they will be providing all of the health care in the province, that no private clinics are allowed, that no private partnerships are even allowed anymore, like we had, that's the past. The government's responsible for everything. And they have a monopoly on every patient in this province. In which case we say, okay, if you want to be in charge of everything, that we will ensure that you are providing everything that you need to be providing. So Guardian Angels is a health advocate program, which is run by basically volunteers that will, this is a calling, certainly, right? That you want to get involved with people who are in this healthcare system to ensure at the very least that they are able to live this life to their natural end, and they're not going to be succumbed by a MAID advocate in the middle of the night when there's no family around to protect their person. So what we need now is you. We need all of you. We need people, all of you out there in virtual Zoom land. We need you to think about becoming a guardian angel. What we're going to do is set up networks, angel networks across this country, and we will match people with people inside of the system, and you will go and you will watch over them. And we even want your pets, because people who are ill, they love to have animals around. It really brightens up their day. And don't worry, we will train you We will give you the training and the support so that you know what to do, so that you know how to be a health advocate, so that when you're with your person and you're visiting them or you're learning about what's happening with them and they're telling you, oh, this is what's wrong with me, we will make sure that you understand what that means, what kind of care and what kind of support they should be receiving. And if they're not, then we're going to do something about that, aren't we? We're going to ensure that the doctors or the nurses, they come around and they make sure that this person is being taken care of properly.
Is this only Delta?
No, absolutely not. No, this is the pilot project here is going to be in British Columbia, and then it's going to be all over Canada. We have people that are waiting for advocates, for volunteers to come so that they can start to match them. So no, the vision is for it to be a national program. And from what we have seen, I do believe that it will be successful because there are many people in this country that are very concerned about what's happening. That, you know, we are Canadians. We believe in compassion. We believe in taking care of our people. And we believe in helping people live. But what we really need, I mean, we can do all of these things, right? And we can try to watch people. We can try to make sure they get with the kind of services that they require so they're not asking for death. But what we really need is a safe place for the dying. We need sanctuaries for the dying in this country. And I call it hospice sanctuary, where hospices are not going to be forced to kill their patients, and that every province will allow a sanctuary or 2 or 3 to be built and to be functioning. I mean, that is the ultimate dream. It wasn't a dream 10 years ago, we were doing it. Now it's a dream that, you know, we hope to fulfill, certainly in my lifetime. And I do believe that together, that's the only way this is going to happen, that we need to stitch back the moral fiber of our country. And it's not going to happen by government doing anything. It's going to happen by individual Canadians standing together, caring for their families, their friends, their people. That is the future. And without that, there will be no future. So I thank you very much for your time. If you want to get in touch with us, we're deltahospicesociety.org. You can go on to our website. We have a telephone number where you can call us. You can request DNEs, and you can also request to be part of the Guardian Angels program. deltahospicesociety.org. Thank you.
Okay, so if there's any questions, you can put them in the chat or someone can ask a question here. Gordon just said that was an outstanding presentation, so thank you very much. The law requires consent of the patient. That's absolutely correct. There's 2 issues with consent. One is that there's in every major hospital or health care institution, there's what you call a MAID team. So I'll give you a quick story. I know this is going to jump into my talk a bit, but this is what we're going to do now in a second. I got a call from somebody and they were really upset because what had happened is that they were visiting their father as he was nearing death, and he was in palliative care in Ottawa, and they were visiting him. And so what happened was that the whole family was there, and the MAID team came in, the team to ask about, do you want euthanasia, right? And the father said, no, I'm not interested. You know, they had this, very short discussion. He wasn't interested. So the MAID team went out. And so here you have the whole family together. They then went down after visiting for a while. They went down and had a coffee, the family, and they came back to his room like half hour later or so. And the father said, well, guess who came as soon as you left? The MAID team came back in. So they came in to try and convince him that MAID was the best idea for him. I got a call from a woman a couple of years ago in the Hamilton area. And this woman was, a believer. She was a person of faith. She was and she told me that her husband had been involved in pro-life and everything. And he was nearing death and he was asking for MAID, for euthanasia. She had no idea. She couldn't figure out why this was, because this was exactly the opposite of his beliefs. Like, this is something he would have never asked for. and she couldn't figure it out. So, we talked about this for quite a time, and then what happened is she sat down with him and they had a good long discussion, etc. And, a meeting of the minds, and he decided not to die by maid. He decided to die a natural death, and that's what happened. But when he died a natural death, so he was in a hospice, but when he died a natural death, what happened is that right after he died, this nurse came up to this man's wife, the woman who had called me, and she had said, oh, well, a couple of weeks ago, your husband was going through a lot of distress in the middle of the night. And, existential distress, emotional, etc. And she says, so I spent about 2 hours talking to him, and I think I really relieved his emotional suffering, etc. And in the end, he agreed that maid was the best idea for him. So then, the only good thing about that is now she understood why her husband had been asking for it when this was something totally foreign to what he believed. So, that's the first question about consent. Are these people truly consenting at the time of death? And is there a form of pressure going on? So that's the second thing. Secondly, when we're talking about this situation, often there's people who are going through great psychological, emotional issues. So is there consent, truly consent? The final thing is there's a type of, how would you say, situation, there's a type of a maid pressure. And what you should do is actually almost wait for my presentation, because I've got a couple stories in there that really bring it together. But you can see what I'm saying. It's not that simple. In my presentation, I always tell people we're not computers, we're human beings. And so it's not that simple. And so when Angelina and in my presentation, I was talking about how do we protect each other? This is a primary goal here, because the fact is as a human being, we get pressured by these things. The point of it is that we as human beings sometimes get ourselves in such a state that it's almost like we wear blinders. The reason it's not a good idea to kill people is there's a faith reason. That's primary for most of us. But I mean, even in a human sense, once you allow someone to be involved with killing people, you're assuming something of the people that you're assuming that they're freely choosing. And you can't assume that, because you can't separate the decision of a physician or a nurse to try and convince you or to try and be involved with killing you and your death. You can't separate it. It's really not that simple. Like I always say, we're not like a dog. We're really not like a dog. We're a human being, and dogs are sort of a simpler creature. They're easy to please. You take them for a walk and they're happy. You give them a treat and they're happy. They're a simple being. Whereas humans, we're far more complicated. But you should wait for my presentation before you go on with more questions. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just wondering, are all doctors and nurses agreeing to this, or how you say there's a maid team on a certain ward in a hospital? Are there some sort of primed to talk to patients, or how does that work?
So I'll deal with that question, and then I'll deal with your question. So the issue is that all major hospitals have a maid team, and there's two reasons for it. Now, they might have more than one maid team, because obviously, if they're doing multiple maids in a day, obviously, they might need more than one group of people doing it. There was two reasons for it. One, they were, as Angelina said, they were trying to provide access. So if you have a team of people who are willing to kill you, obviously speaking, they're going to have an ability to provide access. But the second reason is there's quite a few doctors and nurses who want nothing to do with it. They want absolutely nothing to do with it. And so you had the problem in the very beginning of doctors and nurses who wanted nothing to do with it, being upset that their conscience rights were being pressured on them. And they were saying, no, I'm not going to participate. So the whole medical system decided, oh, we're going to form these teams of a doctor and a nurse who are willing to, go around, and let's say every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, they're doing maids. Lord have mercy on us. I mean, that's the kind of thing that's happening. And in a bigger hospital, they could be doing it every day. So you actually see it in some of the data. You see that there's some doctors who do a lot of it, or some nurses that are doing a lot of it, right? And there's maybe the odd doctor who may only do one a year, and most doctors don't do it at all. In fact, the data shows that there's very few physicians and nurses actually involved directly in it. If you compare it to the total number of doctors and nurses in the system, there's actually very few willing to do it. But you can understand the maid team. The problem with the maid team is then they become pretty convinced that what they're doing is a wonderful thing, and they're constantly selling what their product is. Their product is killing, and they're selling it. They're coming to you, and in order to have access, they're going to say that they're doing the right thing because they're asking everyone. It's your right to have this. But in fact, what they're doing for some people is they're pressuring them. There was an online question about having a safe space, considering the rules of the government. How will it be possible to have a safe space? That was the question.
Exactly. And again, you know, like I said to you, that, you know, that's our dream. You know, we're asking for government, some government in this country to allow us sanctuary. You know, they allow all kinds of sanctuary cities all over North America for, oh, whatever, sanctuary city. Well, we want sanctuary too. So, you know, we're looking for a place, we're looking for a government that will support, just leave us alone, to just practice. We're not radical, for heaven's sakes, to just practice authentic palliative care in a hospital facility setting to take care of people. It's actually a great help to the public health care system for citizens to, you know, take on the burden of taking care of one another. So this is what we're looking for. And, you know, it is my hope that someplace in this country, we will be given that opportunity.
So my name is Alex Schadenberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. I will give you, I think, an overview and tell you a bunch of stories, and I think that's sort of important. Once again, we came to Victoria. This is sadly the place where the highest percentage of deaths are euthanasia, and that's a very, in the world actually, and that's a very sad reality. There you go. Highest percentage, yeah. So many people view the euthanasia-assisted suicide issue within the paradigm of suicide. So they talk about this as being a negative, as a suicide is seen as a negative act, but they view assisted suicide though as a personal act. So right off the bat, they're selling this as the my body, my choice idea. And they're justifying it based on the idea that these people are dying anyway. So we hear this, so they've gotten into this whole idea. And we see the stories from the other side are all about people who are nearing death, people who are suffering. So they're selling the narrative of these people are nearing death and they're suffering. And Canada, of course, legalized this in June of 2016. You know, obviously I oppose euthanasia. The people here today who oppose euthanasia oppose it because it's an act of killing another person. That's what this is. It's done by lethal injection or by a drip system. We are opposed to killing people. So once we get into that issue right off the bat, you can understand our point of view. We're opposed to killing people. I think we need to be honest when we're talking about the issue, and we need to say it as it is, because a lot of people recognize that the terms have been redefined on us. We now call this MAID in Canada. MAID is a Canadian term. It was designed in Canada, the term MAID, and it's to make you feel better about killing, medical aid in dying. Assisted suicide is also legal in Canada, but it rarely happens, meaning that almost all the deaths are euthanasia. Assisted suicide is a similar act. It's done for a similar reason. The difference is that you have to take the drug yourself, whereas with euthanasia, they do it to you. And euthanasia was legalized by creating an exception in the criminal code to murder. And I think that's very important because, you know, it's being sold as a healthcare act. They keep telling us it's about healthcare, and yet in fact it was legalized by creating an exception in the criminal code to murder. And what the law actually does is it gives physicians and nurse practitioners the right in law to kill you. That's what the law actually does. Okay, so why are people asking for euthanasia? I think this is the primary question at hand. It's not there's two issues, of course. Why are people being approved for euthanasia? And I think that Angelina's touched on some of that already. And basically, you know, in Canada, now that we passed Bill C7, essentially you need to have they say you have to have unremittent suffering, but the fact of it is that that's a personal thing, but you have to have a medical condition that they consider to be not terminal, because you don't have to be terminal anymore, but you have to have an irremediable medical condition. So when people with disabilities say that the law actually focuses on them, that's correct, because people with disabilities have an irremediable medical condition. Most people die by euthanasia, though, not because of their medical condition, or they're not seeking it because of their medical condition. They're seeking this because of the fact that they're depressed, they're lonely, they're experiencing feelings of hopelessness. They believe their life has lost meaning, purpose, or value. So they have a medical condition, whether that be physical or psychological, which allows them to be approved for killing, but they're actually asking for it because they are seeking a death. This is so what I'm saying is it's not about freedom, it's about a cultural abandonment. We're abandoning people to their death. What's interesting about Canada is we legalized euthanasia in June of 2016, then we expanded it in March 2021 by Bill C-7. So what we did when we expanded the law, we did so, it's interesting how we did it because we actually contravened what the law said in order to expand the law. The law had said when we legalized it that we'd have to do a 5-year review of the law. And the law said that that had to start in June of 2020. Instead, what Canada did is we expanded the law. They said it was based on a Truchon court decision. I'm not going to get into that, but essentially what we did is with Bill C-7 went much further even than the Truchon court decision. So the Health Canada report in 2021. Now we don't have the 2022 data yet because the government's very slow in producing the data for us. I do have data from many of the provinces. But the Health Canada released the 2021 data saying there was 10,064 reported assisted deaths in Canada. So some of those were assisted suicide, very few in fact, and almost all of them were euthanasia, lethal injection. In 2021, 4.8% of all deaths in British Columbia were euthanasia, and 4.7% of all deaths in Quebec were euthanasia. That same report, though, identified that Vancouver Island was the highest in Canada with around 10%. Okay, the island was around 10%. I'm assuming that throughout British Columbia, you have different types of regions, and I'm assuming some of those regions were fairly low because you have some regions that are far more conservative in their thinking than others, and but the island was very high. And the data comes from the report submitted by the physicians and nurse practitioners who cause your death. So how the law works is that the doctor or nurse practitioner, now it takes 2 of them, it takes 2 signatures to approve a death. But that's not even an issue because the first one who assesses you then will send you to a second one. The second doctor or nurse practitioner who has to sign off is usually someone who's known to that first person. So obviously they're going to someone who's pro-euthanasia to sign off. So it's not an issue of, oh, you received these 2 great assessments and they were being careful. In some jurisdictions that might actually happen that way, meaning that they're trying to make sure that the independence is real. But the law, what it does is that the doctor who approves your death is the same doctor who can kill you, is the same doctor who has to send in the report to the government. So the law was designed for what reason? To protect the doctors who are willing to cause your death. The law was designed so there would not be any real oversight of the law. And they did that obviously because they wanted the doctors who are willing to cause your death to be protected by the law. So I'm going to give you a little bit of Ontario data. I said I don't have British Columbia data because British Columbia is not willing to release their data. I will see the BC data when the federal data comes out, when the federal government puts out the data. But before then, British Columbia has refused to send us their data, even though it's not, it shouldn't be an issue, right? The point of it is that in Ontario, there was 3,934 euthanasia deaths in 2022. 3,934, and that was up significantly from 2021. But since legalization, they had 13,729. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out to you is of the 13,729, only 3 of those were assisted suicide. The rest were all euthanasia. Now, what's the difference? Well, euthanasia is a form of homicide because the doctor is killing you, whereas assisted suicide was under the law as assisting a suicide. So the doctor would be providing you the means and you kill yourself. Quebec launched an investigation this February because they determined that 7% of all deaths in Quebec were euthanasia in 2022. So the government announced that they were going to do this investigation into why Quebec was the highest in the world. Well, we don't know British Columbia data. I'm assuming that BC is either the same or maybe even a little more, just because BC was higher in 2021. It might be a little less than Quebec in 22, that's possible. Nonetheless, there's no investigation going on in Vancouver Island as to why you're the highest in the world. The Alberta report indicated that there was a 40% increase in 22 and 22. Manitoba actually is interesting. In 2022, Manitoba's data show that they had fewer euthanasia deaths in 2022 than 2021. There is something significant about Manitoba, and Manitoba, the doctors have conscience rights, meaning the Manitoba government passed a law in 2017 saying that no doctor or nurse in any way, they don't have to participate in any way at all, okay? So let me tell you some stories. This is one that many of you know already because Candace Lewis was featured in our film, and I have some copies of the film at the back, the Fatal Flaws film. But what's significant about the Candace Lewis story is it happened in August of 2016. Remember, we legalized in June of 2016. So we're talking only a couple months after legalization. So it shows you how quick some doctors who were pro-death could really get into this. In August of 2016, Candace Lewis, who was born with multiple disabilities, she was 25 years old. She was in the hospital. She's in Newfoundland, and the doctors were convinced that she was dying. So there was no question that Candace was very sick. What happened is the doctor asked Candace's mother, Sheila, do you know that medical aid in dying is legal? And Sheila didn't know. She said, no, she didn't know. And then the doctor said that he wanted to help her. He wanted to help her. He supported assisted dying. He said he supported medical aid in dying, and he wanted to help her. And the family said they weren't interested. So then what happened is the doctor told Sheila, Candace's mother, you see a little picture in the corner, and said to Sheila that she was being selfish because she wasn't willing to be involved with an assisted death for Candace. And then he started pressuring Candace by pressuring her by telling her how sick she was. So what happened in this case is that, and I'm not saying this happens in every case because obviously it doesn't, but what happened in this case is Sheila was so convinced that Candace was actually dying, Sheila decided that if her daughter's dying, she should die at home. So she took Candace home, and she had family and friends help her because she was pretty sick at this point, and they cared for her at home. What happened is Candace got better. Now, I'm not saying that always happens. What I'm saying is in this case, that's what happened. And Candace was in the wedding party for her sister the next year. But the point is that the bigger question is how come in August of 2016, only a few months afterwards, that Candace Lewis was being pressured to death? Essentially, yes, she was very sick, but who has the right to be pressuring someone else to die? And this is the big question that started coming to mind. Roger Foley lives in London, Ontario, and I know Roger reasonably well. We've communicated on several times. Roger is somebody who has cerebral ataxia, which means that he has a degenerative condition. In August of 2018, he was already in the condition where he needed full-time care. So this is not something that's totally uncommon. Someone needs full-time care. The difference is that Roger in August of 2018 was in the hospital because his caregivers had given him food which caused him to have food poisoning. So Roger decided that what he was going to do is he wanted to have self-directed care. So in Ontario, there is a program for self-directed care, meaning that instead of the government hiring a care agency, Roger would then hire his own caregivers, and then he would be responsible. And he decided that he wanted that because he thought if he was hiring the caregivers, then he'd have control over how he was being cared for. And the government turned him down for that. So that's what this is in Ontario. And so what happened is Roger said that I'm not leaving the hospital. He said, if I'm not going to be given self-directed care, if I can't be assured that my caregivers aren't going to accidentally, poison me with bad food, etc. There's actually more stories to it than that. I'm just trying to get through this information, but you can see what he's saying. He said, I need to have control. So he said, I'm not leaving the hospital. So what happened is that a doctor came into his room and Roger recorded it. So this became a big issue in the media where he was told he had two choices. He could pay $1,500 a day or he could have euthanasia. Those were his two choices. Of course, Roger chose neither. In fact, Roger's still in court with the hospital because the hospital's trying to get the money from him because he spent a fair amount of time in the hospital. Now, I understand that the hospital wanted him out. I get that. They wanted his bed. I totally understand that. But I also understand that Roger should have been given self-directed care. The greater question is, what is the hospital doing saying to him? He's got two choices. You either pay the money or you die by euthanasia. Of course, he recorded it. So let me go through a few other stories with you that really make it come together. I'm taking questions at the end that we've lost a lot of time, so that's just how it is. Nothing personal, A 51-year-old woman died by euthanasia because she had multiple chemical sensitivities. So this was the first big case that hit the media in February of 2022. And I think this wasn't the first case of something that was really controversial because, we already had, a few other earlier stories like Roger Foley, etc. But this was the first in a string of cases we saw last year. There was one after the other of people with disabilities who were talking about how their lives had been affected by euthanasia. But this woman died. She didn't want to actually die by euthanasia per se. She was actually saying she couldn't live where she was living. It wasn't possible. She was on disability benefits. She couldn't afford to live. She was living social housing. It was like an apartment type complex. And she was saying because of her MCS, and she had a very extreme case of MCS, she said because of that, she couldn't breathe. People were doing pot, people were smoking, people were cleaning their apartments with chemicals that she was reacting to. And she got approved then for euthanasia, and she died by euthanasia. It was only a couple of weeks after that case that the next one hit the media of the 31-year-old woman who was also approved for euthanasia, who had MCS. So what you get is a situation where you see in the media, one woman died by euthanasia based on MCS, and then another person requested it and got approved. What happened in this case, though, is that the MCS community was able to intervene. We did post this on our Facebook and all our social media, urging people to support this situation. And the MCS community was able to raise significant money through the GoFundMe. And this woman was able, they found her a place to live where she had a clean place to live, where she wasn't in social housing, where she could actually live her life without constantly reacting to the chemicals around her. There's a climate activist in BC, some of you would know this, he's in Victoria. He, during the euthanasia for mental illness debate, he was urging that we allow euthanasia for mental illness because he has echo anxiety. You guys might have seen that, it was in your local newspapers. So he's saying that because his condition is considered a psychiatric condition, that he would qualify, or he would want to qualify for euthanasia if we allowed it for mental illness. I'm going to get into that in a minute. There's an Ontario man who was approved for euthanasia, but only requested it out of a fear of homelessness. Once again, money was raised for him through the whole GoFundMe, and by a whole group of people. Euthanasia Prevention Coalition also got involved in promoting that. Hopefully several of you donated to that, but he is also now has a place to live. So that's what's important. He's alive. Remember, he didn't want to die. Let's, if you put this story into context, it makes a lot of sense. I'm not saying the euthanasia made sense. I'm saying the story made sense. He was being evicted from his place because the owner had sold the building, and the new owner was going to do repairs and sort of change things. And so therefore he was told he had to find a place to live. But if you're on a disability benefit, you can't afford a place to live. And because of rent controls in Ontario, the place he was in, he could afford, because of course the rents only go up by a certain percentage every year under rent controls. So he couldn't find a place to live, and he didn't want to live on the streets. You might remember this story very well. The Veterans Affairs worker advocated that a Canadian soldier with PTSD ask for euthanasia. So let's put this into perspective. You have a veteran who served time for our country. Now he's experiencing PTSD. He's asking the government for help with his PTSD, and the Veterans Affairs worker tells him, you should be asking for euthanasia. Now, what makes this even worse is that the Veterans Affairs Minister, Lawrence Macaulay, when the story first came out, he said, oh, this was just a one situation. It was bad, it shouldn't have happened. It was just a Veterans Affairs worker who made a mistake, we're sorry, but it only happened once. But as we knew, soon after, other stories started coming out, and then they did a little investigation, and then we know that there have been at least 6, there might have been a lot more than that. We know that there was at least 6 cases. We know that at least 2 people died by euthanasia because they had contacted the Veterans Affairs Department with PTSD and were told you should be considering euthanasia. And so, you start realizing, oh, it's greater than that. And then what happened is Christine Gauthier, who is also a Canadian veteran. She was injured as a Canadian soldier. She became a Paralympic athlete, and she was asking Veterans Affairs for a wheelchair ramp. So it was actually a wheelchair lift she needed. And they told her that they couldn't get funding for it, and if it was that bad, she should be asking for euthanasia. Now, if you think that's crazy, well, yes, that is very crazy, but let's put this into perspective. Here's someone who served our country, was injured serving our country, and now the Veterans Affairs workers are telling her that maybe she should be considering euthanasia. The first story of the Veterans Affairs worker, the soldier with PTSD, he ended up receiving treatment in the US. And a lot of people don't realize that, but if you follow the story further, you'll realize he ended up going to the US. He was so upset with what happened in Canada, and he didn't feel comfortable anymore with being in Canada. Madeline, Well, Madeline is not her name, but she's also here in British Columbia. She has a rare medical condition and she was unable to get treatment. So she lives in British Columbia and she knew that she could get treatment in the US, but she couldn't get treatment in Canada. But she couldn't afford to go to the US for treatment. So here she's saying, there were several articles about Madeline, and I republished all those articles. And actually, I knew about the Madeline case quite early because her mother had contacted me, all concerned about Madeline and what was going on with Madeline because of her condition. But what she was saying is, I can't get medical treatment in British Columbia, but I can get euthanasia. Think about that. I can't get medical treatment. I can get it in the US, but I can't get it here in British Columbia, but I can get euthanasia. And this is the kind of thing that Madeline was writing about. She didn't want to die, but she was thinking, well, what choices are you giving me? There was a 23-year-old young man in Ontario. Some of you might have saw this story. He had diabetes. So here he's in a situation where what happened is during COVID, he got quite depressed and he is insulin dependent. So he decided to go off of his insulin. He decided not to take insulin and it didn't work out very well for him. He had very bad reactions. He started to lose his eyesight. In fact, at this point, it was post-COVID. He was stable, but he was upset that he had lost 70% of his eyesight. He had some other health problems that had developed during COVID when he wasn't taking his insulin. But his mother saved his life. So what happened is he was approved for euthanasia. Think about this, a 23-year-old with diabetic. Yes, he had lost about 70% of his eyesight. Nonetheless, he asked for euthanasia. He was approved for it at the MAID clinic in Toronto. It's called MAID House. You have a euthanasia clinic here in Victoria. There's also one in Vancouver. So anyway, what happened with him is that his mother wrote letters to the government and to the media, and she started a petition. We helped her with the petition. We promoted the petition. There was well over 10,000 signatures on that petition. But what made it clear is that she was very, very upset that someone was actually going to kill her son. So what she did is she named the doctor. So if you'd actually seen that petition online, you see it mentioned the doctor's name. All we did is republish her petition. So, you know, we felt we were pretty safe. It was her petition. It was her doing it. But in the end, the pressure on the doctor was so great, he decided not to do the euthanasia. And I remember that Margaret called me up that one morning. She calls me up. She says, it's really great news. Dr. So-and-so has told my son he's not going to do the euthanasia. And I said, yes, but be careful because your son was already approved. So all they need is another doctor willing to do it and your son could be killed, right? He's been approved, right? 2 signatures signed him off, right? But in the end, no doctors were willing to do it. So I think his mother, by being so loud about it, actually clearly saved his life. And, you know, some of these things are, you may say controversial, but you have to save someone's life. Anyway, the family of Joan Rowaway. Joan is was in the Fraser Health region of BC. She had cancer. And her oncologist and her discussed the situation because the oncologist was telling her there was nothing more they could do for her. Now, there's nothing new about that. That's not the issue. Like it comes to a point with treatment, sometimes there's nothing more you could do, right? In the case of Joan, though, in the discussion about the treatment situation, the oncologist brought up the issue of MAID. And you can understand she's terminally ill. She's clearly dying. They've said there's nothing more you can do for her. The doctor actually ticked off all the boxes on the MAID request form. That's how they do it. There's the request form. They have a series of boxes, and they have the doctor would tick them all off and then sign it, and have to get another signature on it, right? He did that. She was approved for MAID, but she never asked for MAID. So then what happened is that she was being cared for. Look at the picture there. You can't see it too well here. She's living with her daughter and her son-in-law. And they receive a phone call from Fraser Health saying, well, we're coming to get Joan for her MAID. And the family's like, well, Joan, she's not asked for MAID. She doesn't want MAID. And they're saying, no, we're coming to get Joan. She's been approved for MAID. She had asked for MAID. And then they thought that the family was actually then denying her her right to die. So they came to the house to come get Joan. And they said, well, we're coming to Joan because we've scheduled her MAID. Her MAID's been scheduled, you know, come to get Joan. And they refused to let Joan go. So finally, Fraser Health was smart enough to send someone over who was a bit more, you know, willing to consult a bit. And they asked Joan if she wanted MAID, and she said no. But think about this whole situation, and you're wondering where we're going in BC when Fraser Health is going to come to someone's house to take them away for their maid. What about the story of Donna Duncan? Donna Duncan in February 25th in the Abbotsford area had a car accident, and she was diagnosed with a concussion. And this was just before the COVID restrictions began, as you might see. It happened on February 25th, 2020. So Donna was in a situation where she wasn't receiving treatment for her concussion, and it wasn't very good. She went through a lot of pain and suffering, and she needed to have rehabilitation, and she wasn't receiving it. There was a lot of restrictions on medical treatment at the time. So on October 29th, 2021, she died by euthanasia. And there's a picture of her two daughters who were shocked. How could she have been approved for euthanasia? How could she have been approved? How did this actually happen? You know, it's very interesting because what does the law say? And I think we have to understand the problem with our Canadian law. It's one thing that we kill people, but our law is written in such a way to protect no one. Our law is there to protect the doctors who are willing to kill you, or the nurses who are willing to kill you. So the law says there's certain, criteria, and it names off the criteria. You have to be 18 years old. You have to have unremittent suffering. Of course, unremittent suffering, if I were a physician and you were telling me you had unremittent suffering, how could I say you don't, right? There's nothing, there's no way to analyze that per se, right? That's what you're saying. The other thing, they have to have an irremediable medical condition. What is an irremediable medical condition? I'm assuming there's several people in this room, and there's probably quite a few people online who have an irremediable medical condition. So the fact of it is that then it says that the doctor must be of the opinion you fit the criteria of the law. Our law says they must be of the opinion you fit the criteria of the law. So obviously speaking, when Donna Duncan dies by euthanasia, and her daughters asked the police to do an investigation, that sadly, the law was designed that if there were an investigation by police, then in fact, the police would find nothing wrong had happened, because the doctor would say, we were of the opinion Donna fit the criteria of the law. Well, we're all of opinions, aren't we? Right? So the fact of it is the law is designed to protect the doctors who are willing to kill. Alan Nichols. Well, Alan Nichols was in Chilliwack, and he died by euthanasia in August of 2019. So what happened to Alan is Alan, when he was younger, had a brain tumor. And when he was 16, he died at the age of 61. And that brain tumor was, the surgery was done, and it was successful. He lived his life. He worked throughout his life. There wasn't a problem that way. But as his family would say, he went through a lot of times of depression, where he went really deep into depression, where he had suicidal ideation. So in August of 2019, when he's asking for his life to be ended, this was not the first time he went through suicidal ideation. This was not a new situation for Alan. The only difference was this: in August of 2019, the hospital at Chilliwack took his request for euthanasia as a request for MAID, right? They assessed him and they determined that he qualified, and they killed him. But all he was going through was suicidal ideation. What he needed was treatment. The family found out 3 days before he died that he was going to die by euthanasia, and they begged the doctors to reassess him. They begged the doctors. They said, if you look at his medical records, you'll notice this is not Alan's first time he's gone through this situation. This was not Alan's first time going into the psych hospital. It was not the first time. It's not that Alan was someone who had mental illness, but he had these deep depression times, and then he was better again. As they said, he needs time. But in fact, the doctor said he's been approved, and they killed him anyway. The picture there is with Alan with his brother the night before he died. Euthanasia for mental illness. So this is where Canada's going now. It's technically there already. So what happened in March of 2021, when we passed Bill C-7, we included in Bill C-7 euthanasia for mental illness alone. So that was legalized in March of 2021, euthanasia for mental illness alone. But at the time, the government put a 2-year moratorium on it because they said we weren't ready to kill people for mental illness yet. And you might notice that recently we put another 12 months onto that. So now we're talking about March of 2024, where we will allow euthanasia for mental illness alone. Now, I should say something to you that should really cause some big stir, and that is the fact that if we've had all these cases of people with disabilities who have found themselves experiencing homelessness, poverty, inability to receive medical treatment, think about people with mental illness. Think about the waiting lines for getting to see a mental health professional. You know, in some jurisdictions, you'd be waiting a very long time before actually getting to see a mental health professional. And yet the law would allow euthanasia within 90 days. So you could be approved, you could die before you ever receive treatment. Further to that, if you look at our homelessness problems, we have serious homelessness problems, whether it be Victoria, Vancouver, or my city of London, Ontario. And a lot of these people who are experiencing homelessness, not all of them obviously, but a lot of them are experiencing issues around mental illness and addictions and issues like that. And they need help. These people need serious help. And I really indict the government. I really challenge them, because are they actually helping these people at all? If you think about it, the problem is getting worse, not better. And these people really do need help. And it's wrong how it's going. But if you allow euthanasia for mental illness alone, then they would have to have a situation where they have an irremediable medical condition. An irremediable medical condition. Irremediable means that it's not going to be you're not going to get better. So that's why I say people with disabilities tend to be defined as having an irremediable medical condition, because their disability means they have a disability, right? They're not getting better. That's just how they are, right? That's how they are, right? So the fact of it is so Dr. Sonia Gain, who's a past president of the Canadian Psychiatric Association, he wrote, and he's been saying over and over again, it's impossible to predict whether mental illness conditions are irremediable. He's not saying that nobody with a mental illness condition is irremediable. He's just saying it's impossible to predict who they are. And he talks about that in his experience. Now, he's a professor at the University of Toronto. He is a leader in psychiatric care in Canada. And he makes it quite clear, I can't tell you which of my patients will get better and which ones won't. I don't know that, because sometimes you have a patient that seems to have sort of quite minor issues and then seems to just persist, and others seem to have a very deep issues, and they do get better. And he said, I can't predict who's going to get better and who's not going to get better. All I know is there are treatment for these people, right? But if you're going to say they have an irremediable medical condition, then you can like kill them. And this is exactly the point. Psychiatrists are going to have to determine who lives and who dies. Dr. John Mayer said, while allowing a medical assistance to dying solely because of a mental illness doesn't take into account that those suffering from severe mental illness may not be capable of making the best decisions for themselves. I think that's quite obvious. I always point to the fact that, and then he recently said, you're assisting someone in the completion of their suicide. That's how he described assisted suicide, euthanasia, for someone with mental illness. Because often with their mental illness, one of the conditions, or one of the symptoms of it, is that they're going through suicidal ideation. So they need treatment, they need care, they need time. The other thing I keep pointing out, Dr. John Mayer, he's so just so you know who this guy is, he's a psychiatrist who primarily focuses on hard cases. So a psychiatrist who might have a patient who has a lot of promise but doesn't seem to be improving, they'll often get referred to Dr. Mayer. He's actually also the editor of a psychiatric journal. He's quite an important man, but he's pointing out that the wait times also for programs in Ontario are up to 5 years. Now, of course, I realize this depends on where you live. I'm not sure which community he's referring to. So obviously, if you lived in Ottawa, there'd be different wait times than if you lived in London, Ontario, and et cetera, right? Nonetheless, he's pointing out that some places it's right now around 5 years for a wait time, and yet, of course, they could be killed within 90 days. So Canada did set up that parliamentary committee, but typical Canada again, even though the original law said that we have to do an examination of the law. So what happened is, go back, when we legalized euthanasia in June of 2016, some of the members of parliament who ended up voting in favor of it were still quite concerned about it. So that's why they added in this whole clause that they have to re-examine the law after 5 years, right? So that was supposed to begin in June of 2020. And of course, we didn't do that. Instead, we expanded the law. Then after we passed Bill C-7, the government set up another committee. And once again, they weren't trying to examine the law. What were they trying to do? Further expand the law. So what was that committee looking at? It was looking at palliative care. It was looking at issues related to disability. Yes, it did look at that too. But it was looking at euthanasia for mature minors and euthanasia by advance directive and a few other things. So while the committee was talking about the issue of euthanasia for mature minors, the Quebec College of Physicians presenting on that said, yes, we support euthanasia for mature minors, but we also support euthanasia for infants, newborns, infanticide. Now let's think this out. Euthanasia of newborns. How was euthanasia sold to us in Canada? It was sold to us based on autonomy my right to choose, ability to consent, mature adults, right? That we wouldn't be coerced. That's how it was sold to us, right? It was all about pain and suffering. But when you're talking about a newborn, do newborns have the ability to request this? Do they have the ability to consent? Think about this. This is a totally new concept now. Really, what we're talking about is eugenics. We're talking about ending the life of someone who's deemed unworthy of life. Now, of course, it's not much different than other things we're already doing. Nonetheless, when I put down life unworthy of life, you can understand what I'm saying, because that's exactly what we're talking about now. I go further with this and I say, well, if we end up going this route, now obviously the government is not at this moment talking about euthanasia for newborns, infanticide, but if this gets discussed further and then we actually go that route, who else can't consent? Who else can't request? People with dementia, Alzheimer's, etc. They can't request or consent either. So obviously speaking, these kind of expansions, when I say to people, every time you open a door, there's another door behind it. That's what we're talking about here. The report from the parliamentary committee then said that they support euthanasia for mature minors and by advance directive. Now, what is a mature minor? A mature minor is not based on an age. A mature minor is based on an assessment. So they're not saying any age group at all. What they're saying is, and I know in the media they kept on saying, people between the ages of 12 and 18 or 14 and 18. No, a mature minor is based on a physician doing an assessment but stating that this person is capable of consenting to the question at hand, right? So it could be an 11-year-old or a 10-year-old, or it could be a 15-year-old. It's all based on an assessment. So mature minor is not a defined area. Both of those issues, euthanasia by mature minors, for mature minors, and advance directive, totally change the nature of consent. The other thing about euthanasia by advance directive is it's a serious problem because it doesn't allow you to change your mind. So the problem with this situation is if you put in your advance directive that you would want to be killed by euthanasia in a certain circumstance, remember, an advance directive document only comes into legal force when you can't make decisions for yourself. So that means you're not capable of changing the document because you're not legally capable of consenting to change the document. So therefore, if you sign such an advance directive requesting that someone kill you in a certain circumstance, you cannot change your mind when that document comes into place. Someone would then make the decision to kill you, and they would have the right to do so because you requested it. There is a good thing going on. Ed Fast, who is a Conservative member of Parliament, introduced Bill C-314. It did have its first hour debate in Parliament. This is a bill that would prohibit euthanasia for mental illness. It amends the criminal code to do so. What it basically says is that mental illness is not an irremediable medical condition and does not qualify for MAID, essentially. So therefore, they wouldn't be allowed to do euthanasia for mental illness. Now, here's the thing, that bill will get its second hour debate sometime either late September or early October, unless a trade goes on in Parliament. And we need people to support that bill. I'm not suggesting that there is another thing. Even if Parliament were to support that bill, and I really hope they do, it would have to get through the Senate. And remember, the whole thing about euthanasia for mental illness actually came out of the Senate. I'm not going to get into all that history. We don't have time. But I just have to tell you that when Bill C-7 was being debated, it was the Senate that insisted that euthanasia for mental illness be added, okay? BC government defunded the Delta Hospice Society. Well, you heard that talk already. Why? Because they refused to kill their patients. Okay, this is very important. We have a problem with conscience rights for doctors in Canada. Ontario has a rule that says doctors have to do an effective referral. So what that means is if someone requests euthanasia, the doctor would have to do, and the doctor is opposed to killing you, the doctor would have to send you to someone who's willing to arrange the killing. That's how the rules work in Ontario. So, it makes it a serious problem. We've lost several very good doctors in Ontario and in other places who have left Canada or gone to other jurisdictions because they don't have conscience rights and they're not willing to kill you. Euthanasia is sold to the culture as enabling personal autonomy and choice. It's my body, my choice, it would say. I don't know where you've heard that before, but, we're told that this is for people who are suffering and nearing death. We're told that it's not a form of suicide, because the person is rationally choosing to die. Are they actually rationally choosing to die? All of these points are either philosophically wrong or not usually the case. The question is, why do people actually ask for euthanasia? That's the great question. That's the great question for us, for dealing with trying to visit people and help them. Same idea with the program that Angelina's working on setting up. We recognize that most people have a medical condition that allows them to qualify. That's not difficult in Canada, having a medical condition that allows you to qualify to be killed. But why they're actually asking for it. Now, you may say, Alex, what are you saying? What are you telling me? Well, you know, you have to always ask people when they call you. Like I get calls regularly from people who want to die by euthanasia. Now, usually it's because we do have a helpline, maybe because one of the people like yourselves have given this person the number and they call it. They might have seen it somewhere. Maybe they actually were having misgivings about the concept of euthanasia, so they contacted us. I was recently talking to this man and he had multiple health problems. And I really did, you know, I was very emotionally, moved by his position, what was happening to him. Nonetheless, he wanted to die by euthanasia, by MAID, right? And I was talking to him and I thought, I need to actually ask him, why actually do you want someone to kill you? Because you have to ask them, because that's what it's about. It's about someone killing you. And he said, well, because there's nobody in my life. I have no one in my life. No one who cares about me. You know, so even in his situation with his multiple health problems, and obviously when I was hearing him talking, I knew he would qualify. I'm not saying I would want him to qualify. I just knew he would. Nonetheless, the point of it is that even he was making it quite clear. He was lonely. He was going through emotional angst. He was feeling his life had no meaning, purpose, or value. He wanted his life to be ended. These are deaths of despair. This is not about freedom, choice, and autonomy like the other side wants to tell you. It's about deaths of despair. There are some radical autonomists out there, though. There is a culture of abandonment that we're facing with euthanasia. And we have a very lonely culture. We have a culture of a lot of people who live alone, who are suffering alone, going through this difficulty alone in life. And so like Angelina, we recognize that it's essential for people who believe that life has value, life has purpose and meaning, that we be involved with visiting those people who we know. It's important that we protect our own. And I think Angelina's talk ended the same way as mine is, the importance of caring for our own, protecting our own, because the culture right now is a culture of death. And there's a lot of people going through a very difficult time. We can change this world one person at a time. I might not be able to change the world in general, but I can change the people of the world for the people around me. Usually, euthanasia also threatens my life. It threatens all of your lives. And the reason is because you're human. Earlier, this gentleman asked me that question, why would someone still be asking for it? And I said, it's because they're human. And that seems like an easy sort of response, but it isn't actually. Human experience tells me that it's normal for you or for me when we're experiencing a serious illness or personal difficulties, that we might be also lonely, etc., but we'll fear for our future. We'll question our purpose for living. We'll experience existential distress or situational depression. It's normal for us to lose hope. It's normal. We're human. Suffering alone and loneliness and isolation and depression, loss of hope or purpose, these are all leading reasons why people are asking to have someone end their life. And we all experience these feelings. None of us are immune from this. And of course, all of us experience these things to a different degree. I understand that. But we all experience these human experiences and emotions and feelings. We're all affected by the legalization of euthanasia because we all go through these same similar emotions and feelings. Cultural loneliness also, we know, affects our health because we have a lot of loneliness in the culture. If you don't actually agree with me about the loneliness, just ride the bus. Go through town on the bus, look around. Yes, there's a lot of people with a lot of, joie de vivre. There's a lot of people who are lonely though, and you see it. And this is a sad reality of our culture. People say, it's my freedom. No, sadly, the culture's abandoning you. It affects our quality of life, and it can be a threat to our life. We must focus on visiting the lonely, caring for our own, our members of our churches, our communities, people we know around us, our neighbors. We need to replace the culture of death with a culture of care. By being with others, what are we actually doing? We're making a difference in our lives. We're helping to protect them from euthanasia. So as Angelina is working on their program, we've been working with Compassionate Community Care on a very similar idea about training people to be involved with visiting, training people to be involved with advocacy and issues like that. Because we can change the world one person at a time. We can protect people by caring for them. So by visiting, what are you doing? You're journeying with them. You're being with them. You're caring for others. What are we doing? We're affirming a person's purpose for living. We're reducing their loneliness and isolation. Now, we're not being psychiatrists or psychologists, we're being friends, we're being caring people. We help them find a way through their depression and isolation. We allay their fear of suffering. Sometimes the best thing is not to talk at all when you're visiting someone. Sometimes people just need to talk themselves, right? They need to have someone who actually cares enough to listen. God created us to be with others. And if you don't believe in God, then you've evolved to need to be with others. You're a human being. We're interdependent. Interconnectedness is essential to the human person. It's not an accidental thing. It's not a secondary thing. So why do people ask for euthanasia? Well, we're told that people ask for euthanasia because of pain or suffering, but the data suggests that very few people are actually asking for death for those reasons. I'm not saying nobody is. No. But they're not the majority. Most people ask for death because they're going through a difficult time of their life, whether that be physical or psychological. They're feeling lonely, depressed, socially isolated. They've lost hope. They've lost meaning, purpose, or value. They feel their life has no purpose or meaning. So what's going on with this debate? Why are we constantly moving? Like, why is Canada constantly getting worse? Why is this happening? Well, because there was only one line in the sand. So like the Netherlands and Belgium, because they're also going through the same thing, Canada's debating the expansion of euthanasia to children. You might remember Belgium's already done that. The Netherlands has recently announced they're going to be expanding euthanasia to children, to incompetent people, to people who are incompetent with Alzheimer's, dementia, to people with mental illness. Remember, because there's only one clear line in the sand, and that is we prohibit killing. The law has to prevent me from killing you. If the law doesn't prevent me from killing you, or if it doesn't prevent a doctor from killing you, then the law says it's okay to kill. That's what the law says. It's okay to kill. So once that's happened, as we're in the situation, the only question now remains is who does the killing and for what reason? That's all we're debating, because the question of is it okay to kill is already passed. There's only one line in the sand, and there's our information. So like Angelina was saying, we're really oriented towards the same sort of thing with as the Delta Hospice Society about trying to provide care and purpose. Now, Compassionate Community Care is a separate organization. It's not the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. It has a separate board, it's a separate entity, but we've been working with them. Euthanasia Prevention Coalition has around 7,000 members right now. Now, not everyone is paid every year, so I guess we don't have 7,000 paid up members. That would be nice. That'd be good for our books. We have supporters right around the world. There are people who are on this call today, who on this event today, from all over, and we will continue to fight, and we believe in caring, not killing. We'll fight for your life. Now, I do have one odd little thing to say. We do need your support. You know, Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, we set up our organization from the beginning to, to try and have everyone involved, everyone who would have an ability to become a member. We were not seeking just those very few, very wealthy people who could enable us to have that kind of support. We were seeking support from everyone in small amounts, large amounts, whatever that might be. And so because of that, we're a very wide organization, but we are always in need of your support. It'd be nice if we had a situation where you had those like 7 donors who donated every year X amount of dollars, and you had your your $1 million budget and everything's fine and good and unlike the death lobby, we're not getting money from the government. Neither is the Delta Hospice Society. They're not getting money from the government. We're not receiving money from the government, even though the CAMAP, which is the euthanasia group that supports the euthanasia doctors and nurses, they're receiving over $3 million a year. We don't get that kind of money. We don't get anything from the government. That's not what's happening. So we need your support. This doesn't happen by accident. It happens by people supporting us. I'm going to ask that we not have questions until the very end, and I'm going to introduce Catherine Foster to give a presentation. Catherine Glenn Foster is the co-founder of EPC USA, and so she's going to give you some information, but not just from the American point of view, but the point of it is that in Canada, we should actually recognize, sadly, that the Americans are not looking at Canada like they once did, because our killing program has gone beyond what they would ever have imagined. They have this, I'll let her go into it. But anyway, Catherine is is a recovering lawyer, and she's still able to practice, but nonetheless, I mean, the fact of it is that
Where did you recover from?
that's a good question. It's just a funny, not even a good joke. It's you could say that it's like a dad joke type thing. But anyway, I'll pass this over to Catherine. I just mean she's not actively in law right now.
Not sick at all, no worries. Well, I am delighted to be here in British Columbia. It is one of my favorite provinces in Canada, which is really tough for me because I love them all. But we got here a couple of days ago and we were driving around in Vancouver, and I don't know how familiar you all are with Vancouver, but there are a lot of tree-named streets in Vancouver. You seen that? Okay, yeah. And one of those streets is called Hemlock Street. And so I'm driving by and I just thought, you know, I am here to talk at a conference about euthanasia. And here I am driving by a Hemlock Street. You know, where else do we know hemlock from, right? We know it from Socrates, because back in the day, Socrates was found guilty by a jury of 501 people of Athens, and he was forced to drink hemlock and die by suicide. You know, a lot of scholars have argued that the charges against Socrates were politically motivated, and they've understood that trial and that conviction as an attack on freedom of speech and an indictment of democracy. And it's just interesting to me that here we are back in that same situation, still talking about death, still talking about politics. What all has really changed in the last couple thousand years? Maybe not that much. So my friend, Nikki Haley, who is running for president of the United States, go Nikki Haley, she says it is a great day in South Carolina, where she's from. You know, tragically, it is not a great day here in British Columbia, because today someone is going to die by euthanasia right here in this province. 46,000 people died in British Columbia just last year. And so we need to ask ourselves, how many of those people died by maid? Sure would be good to know, wouldn't it? You know, maids normally come in to clean things up, right? It seems like we have some things to clean up around here, like policies that put profits over people. Between the shrinking birth rate and the burgeoning maid rate, this country is creating its own debt crisis. This country has begun to see people as liabilities, not as assets. And it has been so evident today, right here in this room, just how impassioned people are about this issue. You only have 37 million people in all of Canada, maybe a little bit less now, thanks to MAID. And over the last few years, they've actually put the brakes on population growth. And so your healthcare system is driving you to make decisions that devalue life, is trying to keep you from going deeper into debt by doing this. But the national debt was actually going down until the year 2010. And then it started steadily rising. And 2 years ago, it just skyrocketed. You heard from Angelina earlier that the best thing that this country thinks it can do is to stop its citizens from caring for their fellow Canadians. Does that make any sense at all? This country is getting a reputation around the world for no longer caring about people. So we had these 6 teenagers outside the Circle K, just sitting on the ground, lying on the ground, passing around a marijuana cigarette, passing around a bottle of Jack Daniels, you know, downing this bottle, and you could just tell that they were not in a good place. How many of those teenagers have a mental illness? How many of them were going through the same thing that so many teenagers go through, that so many of us go through? And we have a world that is seeing Canada take a look at these children and say that instead of providing support, it's okay to usher them to death. A couple days ago, Alex shared with me, did you know that after World War II, there was actually a report that said that if Italy ever fell to communism, that the one place The only place in the entire world that the Vatican would be safe to move to would be Quebec. What a shift we have seen. In America, our politicians have this phrase, it's about people, not politics. Here, it seems that it's about profitability, not people. Is this really the reputation the Canadians want the world to have of your amazing nation? I know it's not. You all know it's not. But the politicians, they have their eye on a different ball. As they say in Recovery Group, the problem isn't the problem. It is a symptom that's indicative of the real problem, and we need to figure out what that problem is. So what I want to do here is dig down into the heart of this issue. I want to dig down into how we got here and just a few of the many, many reasons that we all know why MAID is just so dangerous. So looking down at the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, they have labeled suicide a serious public health problem that can have lasting harmful effects on individuals, families, and communities. And yet, even as this epidemic increasingly threatens our society, we see lawmakers that are proposing and enacting legislation that perversely escalates instead of resolves our suicide crisis. We see proponents trying to medicalize euthanasia and suicide and present it as a treatment. Instead of seeing physician-assisted suicide as just another category of suicide, some are defending and even validating a decision to end one's own life. And they try to recast it as death with dignity, as if other deaths are somehow undignified. But even with the supposed safeguards in the law, and Alex touched on some of those, even if there could be genuine patient consent, even if the drugs could be appropriately and properly dispensed and tracked and independently consumed by the patient as assisted suicide laws claim, and we'll get into some of those issues, we're still talking about suicide. And suicide in all of its forms, it is an attack on the inherent dignity and fundamental value of every single human life. In the words of bioethicist Wesley J. Smith, it sends a lethal message to the weak and infirm that their lives are not worth living. And yet, while suicide generally and assisted suicide specifically have been so prevalent in the public eye in the last few years, the issue is not novel. We have long in our culture struggled with these issues. From the days of suicide by hemlock poisoning, we've had to push back and we've had to advocate for life. But we see these fringe efforts that are coming at us, that are trying to push assisted suicide and euthanasia back into the mainstream as valuable and viable options. Now, this is not new. As I said, the contemporary debate on assisted suicide and euthanasia, it really began with a late 19th century campaign that was based in social Darwinism and in eugenics. According to the now US Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch, many feared that America was itself headed toward degeneracy. The remedy often touted for such concerns was the sterilization and killing of unfit members of society with or without their consent. And so they named all these different types of people who would be eligible for death. But then after World War II, the US said, hang on, maybe that's not the direction we want to go. And the assisted suicide movement lost momentum because everyone started learning about the atrocities from Nazi Germany, practices against the elderly and people with disabilities and the what was termed the racially unwanted. But even then, even as the world witnessed the atrocities of the Third Reich, Switzerland nonetheless became the first country in the world to decriminalize assisted suicide in 1942, where they determined there were no selfish motives. They said if there are no selfish motives, then it's fine. And so now we see Switzerland as a destination for suicide tourism. And I visited there, and I visited Lake Zurich, where they couldn't figure out what to do with the cremated remains, and they started dumping remains into Lake Zurich. That people are going to Switzerland for the sole purpose now of killing themselves. So that's close to 100 years ago now. But the next major change in the law came in the mid-1990s when Australia briefly legalized assisted suicide in the Northern Territory and then quickly became the first and only place to repeal it. And then during the 1990s, we saw courts in Colombia ruling that euthanasia on demand was legal, but then they didn't pass a substantive law on the matter, so nothing really happened, nothing really changed. And then in the 2000s, we saw activists continue to push in the Netherlands and Belgium. In 2002, they legalized euthanasia in Luxembourg 7 years later. And we've seen the expansion throughout Europe, throughout the Netherlands and the Benelux countries. Expansion for euthanizing newborn infants that have what they term unbearable suffering, to permit minors to be euthanized in certain circumstances. And so since then, since 2010, we've seen multiple countries legalizing assisted suicide and or euthanasia, including Austria, Canada, of course, Colombia, Finland, Germany, New Zealand, and Spain, several states in Australia, and most recently, Portugal. It's been tragic to see this expansion across the globe. But on the other hand, numerous legislative and legal efforts to promote assisted suicide around the world and euthanasia around the world, they have largely failed. Most countries and jurisdictions, in fact, have laws that prohibit these practices. And so what are we talking about here, really? We're talking about 20% of US jurisdictions, 10% of Europe, a couple of other countries. We're talking about the places where the law doesn't protect us, but it's also important to talk about the places where it does. And that is almost every nation in the world, in the US, an even greater percentage of states and a greater number of states have passed laws to affirmatively prohibit assisted suicide in the years since Oregon legalized it, than have passed it. And even Oregon and Washington, they have bans on assisted suicide in place. They just have lawmakers who decided to carve out an exception for one particular type of medical professional so that they can help kill you, but no one else can. So it's just a little carve out for people. And so we have assisted suicide activists. They've tried to argue in courts, like I filed briefs in New Mexico. And they tried to say that these laws were never meant to apply to doctors and medical professionals. But when you look back at the legislative history, we find out that in fact, it was meant for exactly that purpose. In fact, a lot of those laws were passed in the mid-1990s in the wake of the Jack Kevorkian scandal, specifically to protect us from predatory physicians. And I've been able to go and to study Jack Kevorkian's suicide tools, his toolkit, in person. And I can tell you, it is chilling to see that. But again, in the years since Oregon, we've seen more states affirmatively ban assisted suicide than have passed laws to legalize it. And the courts have almost universally supported those efforts. Down in the United States, the Supreme Court has consistently found that for over 700 years, the Anglo-American common law tradition has punished or otherwise disapproved of both suicide and assisting suicide. That's important, and it makes sense because the Supreme Court's concerns and lawmakers' concerns and our concerns, they've proven valid. We've seen that assisted suicide, that euthanasia, that they place patients at risk and they exploit vulnerable individuals and they place all of us in harm's way. And even when the laws have supposed safeguards, they can't protect us. First, the reason why people overall tend to seek assisted suicide or euthanasia, or the reason why they consider it at all, it has nothing to do with pain or with fear of pain. In fact, the top reason cited for assisted suicide in Oregon, because in Oregon, we actually have reporting requirements, unlike here in British Columbia. We've seen that the top reasons are fear of losing autonomy, that's 93.3%, of being less able to engage in activities, that's 92% of people cite that as why they're seeking assisted suicide, and loss of dignity, 68.1%. We are talking about depression and hopelessness and fear of loss of autonomy and control. And one study in Oregon shows that the depression specifically is an overlooked factor in requests for assisted suicide. But even with that vulnerability, As Alex pointed out earlier, patients are being entrusted with the decision of whether or not to take their own life. And many of them may be considering euthanasia or assisted suicide because of financial duress or pressure from family members or loneliness or because they're feeling like a burden to someone else. And that is not accounted for in the legislation that we've seen, not in the US and not in Canada. Moreover, the decision to seek euthanasia or assisted suicide, it may often be influenced by misdiagnosis. Current studies show that experts put the misdiagnosis rate at around 40%. And there are reported cases, some of which we've discussed here today, where people have been killed without having any underlying symptoms at all, where the doctor simply made an error. An autopsy discovered that there was one man who died who was perfectly healthy. His underlying disease diagnosis was an error. And prognoses, as we all know, are often wrong as well. About 17% of patients in one recent study were dramatically misinformed of their prognosis. But not only that, aside from these obvious flaws, there are these loopholes that exist in laws that legalize euthanasia or assisted suicide. Loopholes that allow you to doctor shop from doctor to doctor, from state to state, from province to province, wherever you need to go, jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And so people are going and meeting a doctor for the first time often and asking for assisted suicide or euthanasia. And there's no pre-existing doctor-patient relationship. In fact, in Oregon in 2021, the median duration of the physician-patient relationship was only 5 weeks. 5 weeks to determine that someone had the capacity, had the prognosis, the diagnosis, all of this, that would be a valid decision for them. So this is not a decision between a patient and a primary care doctor. This is a decision that's being made between a patient and a stranger. That is wrong. That is not the way this has been sold to us. And it's strange and it's puzzling that as we are in North America, around the world, as we enjoy prosperity, as we enjoy continuing international influence and power, but more and more of us are nonetheless clamoring for new ways to die. And when you look down at why that is, part of that, I think, is due to this phenomenon called suicide contagion, scientifically known as the Werther effect. And there is empirical evidence that media coverage of suicide inspires others to follow suit. There was one study that incorporated assisted suicide statistics, and it determined that legalizing assisted suicide in certain jurisdictions had led to a rise in overall suicide rates, both assisted and unassisted in those states. And that study, it accounted for all the typical demographics. It took a look at demographic information and socioeconomic information and state-specific factors, and it found that physician-assisted suicide was responsible for a 6.3% increase in overall suicide rates, which again kind of takes me back to those kids outside the Circle K. What are they being taught by our laws? What are they being taught by our society, by our lawmakers, by the people who are supposed to be protecting them and giving them hope and giving them opportunities for this next generation? And instead, we're passing laws that are pushing them directly and indirectly towards death. But that's not all, because we have 6.3% increase in overall suicide rate. But let's talk about some of those elder adults, some of the people that we are most charged to protect, the people who need our help and our support and relationship the most. For them, we see a 14% increase in suicide rate when we legalize euthanasia and assisted suicide. But that's not all. We have doctors who have repeatedly expressed concern about legalizing intentional death. We see this from doctors, we see this from nurses, we see this from pharmacists. The medical profession is speaking out, so many of them. And sometimes it seems like they're the voice in the wilderness, but there are doctors and medical professionals and coroners out there who are saying, hang on, this is wrong. This is not what we signed up to do. And even though, you know, a lot of these proponents of assisted suicide, they claim that there are adequate safeguards to protect people, that the way you get the drugs is safe enough, that the way you store the drugs, the way you take the drugs is safe enough, that the whole process by which you figure out, you know, is this person eligible, that provides enough protections. Paul Russell, who founded Hope Preventing Euthanasia and Assisted Suicide in Australia, he articulated it well when he wrote, "I have never come across a safeguard that could guarantee safety for vulnerable people. After all, unless we describe in the law every single illness, every possible remedy, what possibility is there that we could ensure safety? The variables," he wrote, "are infinite. What the supposed safeguards do well is to protect doctors. They are provided with an immunity from prosecution for homicide or assisting in a suicide if they just follow that set of procedures. That's what these laws are doing. They're not protecting us. They're protecting the doctors, the people up above who are trying to target us." So let's come on back to Canada, which arguably has the world's most permissive euthanasia rules, allowing people with serious disabilities to choose to be killed in the absence of any other medical issue. We have seen human rights advocates say that the country's regulations lack necessary safeguards, devalue the lives of people with disabilities, and that they are prompting doctors and health workers to suggest the procedure to people who wouldn't consider it if they weren't bringing it up. We've even seen instances where people have sought to be killed because they weren't getting adequate government support to live. According to Marie-Claude Landry, the head of the Human Rights Commission in Canada, a few years ago, she wrote, "Euthanasia cannot be a default for Canada's failure to fulfill its human rights obligations." She said that she shares the grave concern voiced a few years ago by 3 UN human rights experts who wrote that Canada's euthanasia law appeared to violate the agency's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They said that the law has a discriminatory impact on disabled people and was inconsistent with Canada's obligations to uphold international human rights standards. The director of the Canadian Institute for Inclusion and Citizenship at the University of British Columbia described Canada's law as probably the biggest existential threat to disabled people since the Nazis' program in Germany in the 1930s. And during a trip to Canada, Pope Francis decried what he has labeled the culture of waste that considers elderly and disabled people disposable. He said, "We need to learn how to listen to the pain of the poor and most marginalized." And he lamented the patients who, in place of affection, are administered death. Canada prides itself on being liberal and accepting. But according to a bioethics center in Britain, according to its director, what's happening with euthanasia suggests there may be a darker side. We've seen how Canada is an outlier in its law. Canada's lack of monthly commissions to review potentially troubling cases that Belgium and the Netherlands have. Canada allowing nurse practitioners, not just doctors, to end patients' lives, and provinces specifically instructing doctors not to indicate on death certificates if someone died from euthanasia. We've seen the push, the coercion by medical professionals here in Canada, which is prohibited in some other jurisdictions. And in Canada, you don't have to have tried anything else. You don't have to have exhausted your treatment alternatives before seeking euthanasia, which some other countries do require. A professor of law and disability studies at a university in northwestern Germany said that allowing euthanasia based exclusively on disability was a human rights violation, and wrote, "The implication of Canada's law is that a life with disability is automatically less worth living, and that in some cases, death is preferable." The rules here are too loose. And even when people die when they shouldn't have died, there's almost no way to hold the doctors and the facilities responsible. And so we see doctors running amok and leading some Canadians to seek MAID just in the face of mounting bills. There was one recording that was obtained by the Associated Press where a hospital's director of ethics told a patient that for him to remain in the hospital, it would cost, quote, north of $1,500 a day. And this patient said that mentioning fees felt like coercion and asked, what's the plan for long-term care here? What can we do? And the ethicist said, Roger, this isn't my show. My piece of this was to talk to you to see if you had an interest in assisted dying. Those who decline have been called selfish. Canada's Human Rights Commissioner said that leaders need to be listening to the concerns of those facing hardships, who believe, whether temporarily or maybe it's a long-term thing, but they believe that euthanasia is their only option. And this commissioner called for social and economic rights to be enshrined in Canadian law to make sure that people can get adequate housing and health care and support. She said, in an era where we recognize the right to die with dignity, we must do more to guarantee the right to live with dignity. The big question that we have to ask ourselves today is, what caused the character shift here in Canada? What has happened over the last 2 generations to cause the shift in Canada that went from being a haven of religious freedom, as we saw from that report that said that this should be the home of the Vatican, if anything ever goes down in Italy, move to Quebec. Used to be a haven of religious freedom, used to be a haven of involvement, to a denial of the value of humanity. Something has happened over the last 2 generations, and this is a real question for Canadians. We have 87 people sitting here, here in Parliament, here in British Columbia. 87 people deciding that in this province alone, medical aid in dying should be the norm. Where is the person of courage who's going to turn around and say no? Canadian national debt now tops $1 trillion. Trillion with a TR. Your country, though, is not in a debt crisis. It is in a death crisis. We have become obsessed with how to kill ourselves. I've shared a lot of numbers here with you today. I'm a lawyer, that's what we do. The numbers tell us one thing. It gives us a lot of information, but this is about human lives. And if we see this very human, very real issue in terms of statistics, then we are no different than them. We can talk about statistics, but every person here, every single one of us, we have a story. Assisted suicide advocates are not listening to those stories. What we need to do is create a plan. We need to reach out to the people in our lives. We need to build relationship with them to prevent suicide and create hope. We are here to put up the barrier to suicide and to build a relational bridge of support from person to person, to promote lifelong mental health and well-being, to preserve our understanding of the unique value of every human being, and to protect every life. We have protected hope by doing just that. We have won in jurisdiction after jurisdiction, and it is our job to win again here in Canada. Assisted suicide is dangerous for every single one of us. Our hope, though, lies in the victories in so many places that continue to reject assisted suicide and euthanasia. Our hope lies in organizations like Euthanasia Prevention Coalition that vigorously oppose the mainstreaming of intentional death. Our hope lies in relationship, in listening, and in support. We are living in a culture of death and of despair, a culture of loneliness. It is up to us to build the connections, the bridges, to build that culture of compassion and encounter and care, to change one person at a time and give them that little sliver of hope that they can build on, to create a brighter future and to create a future that we can all live with. Thank you so much for having me. Love British Columbia. Let's do better.
Do we have any other questions here? Yes, sir.
Quick question then about the US.
Okay, I'll re-ask the question after you're done. Yes, sir.
Has any of the US
jurisdictions gone as far as Canada and actually legalized active euthanasia as opposed to assisted suicide?
So the question was, have any US jurisdictions gone as far as Canada with euthanasia, for instance?
No, they haven't. On the other hand, when you look at the way the US laws have been written, they do essentially allow for it. You know, they'll usually term the act of ingestion as simply swallowing, the act of swallowing. Well, that's something that can happen no matter who puts the drugs in your mouth, right? So are there loopholes? Yes, but have they specifically said that you can euthanize someone? No. Right over there, yeah. Yes, so my name is Catherine Glenn Foster. I've been working in this field for, goodness, 20 years, not as long as Alex, but that's okay. And I'm a co-founder of Euthanasia Prevention Coalition USA, which has been around for 7 years. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Being a Christian lawyer, you believe in people have getting the help that they need in terms of justice for an inexpensive price for your services.
Absolutely, yes. So in fact, as a Christian lawyer, you learn a lot about the mental health and the legal profession, which is sadly not very good, but also more broadly, of course, in our society. When you see the mental health issues, the addiction issues that crop up in the legal profession, you can extrapolate that out and you just have so much compassion for the people who need help in our communities. So absolutely, I do believe that people who need help should be able to access it and should be guaranteed the support that they need.
I think there should be a lot more states in your country to ban euthanasia, just as Florida has banned abortion.
Absolutely true. Yes, amen to that. Yes.
Not so much a question, but a statement. 99% of the secular population, there are top 3 out of 10 Christians, that's in my floor, are going with euthanasia for the poor and the homeless.
Yeah.
That is a sickening aspect. Those stats are recent.
Yeah, we see law and culture flow in both directions, right? You know, we say, oh, law flows downstream from culture, but it also goes the other, like goes both ways, is the moral of the story here. You know, law informs culture just as culture informs law. And so when we have legalized intentional killing, when we legalize assisted suicide and euthanasia, then of course, people begin to believe that that's an acceptable option, including many Christians. You know, you have people who, absolutely. Well, that's between them and God, but you know, it's certainly, it raises questions about what we believe in, right? Yeah, so we absolutely need to make sure that we are building the relationships, advocating for what's right, and making sure that we teach people the truth about assisted suicide and euthanasia, all forms of medical aid in dying, because they are harmful. We know that they are harmful, and we know that they go against what everything that God has said, and we can do better.
All right, I wanted to tell you also, there's a man that goes to my church that I criticized for some of the people that went to the Forge Church on in Langford had let their wives die of euthanasia.
That's tough. I think there's another question back there. Did you want to? Yeah.
I have a question from people online, for someone online saying, how can we make our voices heard better in the government? And this is actually a difficult question because right now in our federal government, we have a government that's actually very pro euthanasia. And so what we've been looking at is more the provincial governments that would have we haven't actually really focused enough on the provincial governments. And what I said earlier in my presentation that the law, euthanasia was legalized by creating an exception to the criminal code. So it's not different than what Catherine was saying about Oregon, where they carved out an exception. They did the same thing in Canada. But that means that the provincial government still have control of healthcare. Now, as much as Quebec is going the wrong direction, many people don't realize that Quebec has a different law than the rest of Canada. There's two laws in Canada. There's the Quebec law, and then there's the federal law. I'm not saying one's better than the other, because in fact, they're very similar, but they are different laws. It shows you that in British Columbia or in Alberta or in Manitoba, we can have a different law. They can have regulations, especially since it's being dealt with as healthcare, even though it's not healthcare. There's an exception in the criminal code, right? So it shouldn't be treated as healthcare. How do we deal with government? It's very difficult federally right now because we need, Euthanasia Prevention Coalition is not a charity, but Delta Hospice Society is. So I can't speak for them. I'll speak for Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. We need a government shift. We need a different government because under this government there isn't any interest in anything that we have to say. And then at the same time, federally, the NDP are holding up the Liberals in their place of power. So it makes it a very difficult situation. So how do we do this? Well, it's very difficult. I'm going to say one other thing that's become very difficult. I'm not trying to say there isn't an answer to the question. I think I'm proposing the provincial governments provide us some answer, whereas the federal government right now doesn't. But here's the other thing. Politics has changed in Canada, and we have to reclaim our politics. Because what's happened is that when I was younger, I'm only 55, but when I was younger, politics had not quite shifted yet. So what it meant is that other than government bills or bills that were seen as government priority bills, members of parliament could vote with their conscience on legislation, whether that be assisted suicide or euthanasia, or whether that be, you name it, private members' bills. That is gone. The governments use the power of their government whips to whip the vote every time. So I mentioned about Bill C-314. That's an excellent bill. I think that that EdFast has brought forward a really simple, straightforward, well-worded bill that is not, as long piece of legislation. Is very clear to the point. It's about euthanasia for mental illness. That's what it does. But the problem will be is that there's quite a few members of parliament who've expressed to Ed that they support his concern, but of course their parties are going to whip the vote on them. So either they vote against. So if they're a liberal, they're going to be forced to vote against Bill C-314. Their only hope is to go to the washroom, meaning that they're being told you have to vote a certain way. You can't vote with EdFast. So if you can't vote with EdFast, then you can go to the washroom if you don't want to vote, against Bill C-314. And that's a serious problem because that means the right of democracy is being lost. We don't have the ability to move our members of parliament in a certain way. And that's been a serious problem. We have to reclaim democracy in Canada too.
Alex,
Yeah.
can I quickly comment on that?
You can comment on that, Angelina. I was going to say something else. We do have the Do Not Kill Me cards at the back, and we're happy to send them to any of our participants.
Okay, all right. My background is I actually have a master's degree in political science. So my studying was all about politics. And what I have to say is that politics is downstream of culture. We can't look to the government to solve our problems in this moment. We look to ourselves. We look to third parties. It's called third parties. People like Delta Hospice Society, the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, right? These are organizations that change and move within the culture. We vote with our wallet. We vote with our feet, right? You go woke, you go broke, for example, right? We take up space in the culture. We wear our crosses. We wear our crucifixes. We wear our scapulars. We talk about God. We talk about what's important to us, right? We create the places, the spaces in the culture to reclaim it. And then the politicians decide that perhaps they're going to go that way because they want to be reelected, and we have power. We have an organization that speaks to 10,000 people. Alex has an organization that speaks to 10,000 people. All of our churches, right? We get in Freedom and Faith Coalition. This is how we move the politicians to do what we want. So it doesn't start with them, it ends with them.
I have to agree with Angelina, but my comment still remains the same. We do have a democratic deficit right now in Canada. And I'm not making excuses. I'm just saying that there seems to be a reality right now, which is a problem. But I do believe that we changed the culture. Our event is almost over. Emily, is there any other questions you can text to me? Yes, we have a question in the room.
You know, like.
I'll repeat the question.
There's many layers to things. Thank you very much, all of you, for your good work. But there's another aspect to this, and while we're holding things up to the light, and it's common in the US, if not even greater, and that is Big Pharma's role in all of this. Because the Dr. Mayer, is very likely quite aware, as most of the medical community is, that one side effect, a known side effect of antidepressants is suicidal ideation.
Okay,
Now, how much of that do we speak about? But that has been in existence for a long time.
so the big question you're asking was about, the effect of big pharma on this and, pharmaceuticals, et cetera, and the profits related to all that. And I do think that has some reality, but in the assisted suicide euthanasia question, it's actually counter to their ends because it causes people's death and dead people don't take drugs. So it's not actually fitting their purposes. Their purposes is to give you more drugs so that you have to buy them or the government's buying it and giving it to you, and they're making bigger profits.
But the
so-
antidepressants,
But
they're
yes.
saying people in a mental health state.
So I don't want to get into all this issue about antidepressants because obviously there's some that might be a benefit and some that are not. And I'm not a psychiatrist or a doctor, so I don't want to comment on it. But I will say I can understand your concerns. I do recognize though that big pharma is not actually winning by euthanasia. Yes, the euthanasia drugs to kill someone is something that they're producing, and that's not good. But at the same time, it causes your death prematurely. You stop being a customer of the drug companies because you are dead.
But you might have been taking those antidepressants.
You might have been,
for
right.
years that have made the suggestion in
Yeah,
your
but-
mind, kill yourself.
If I were a psychiatrist, I might comment on this, but I'm not, so I'm not going to comment on the antidepressants. Yes.
I have a question about is an advance directive on your chart legally binding? Because you can choose on that chart, for example, if I have an infection, I
Okay.
can take antibiotics. So can I?
So you should have an-
as a doctor
yeah.
Should not be
Right.
pressuring me.
The questions about advanced directives, are they legally binding? The answer is yes and no. We whether it's the Delta Hospice Society or Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, we sell an advanced directive to protect your life. So we're real believers in the fact that the document you have should have language in it to protect your life. And if you don't have that kind of a document, that's very dangerous. And it's important you've signed it, legally signed it, and you've appointed someone to make decisions for you when you can't make decisions for yourself. Now here, I'm going to give you the key to this. The key to it is, yes, the language of the document is fundamental. Absolutely. We would not produce a life-protecting power of attorney. Now, either with the Delta Hospice Society, producing a power of attorney document. We didn't think it wasn't good to have a document with clear language to protect your life. But at the same time, who you appoint is fundamental. Do not appoint your son or your daughter to be your power of attorney just because they're your oldest son or daughter. Appoint someone who shares your values. Because what happens is those documents come into legal force when you can't make decisions for yourself. So when I commented on euthanasia by advance directive, I said, one of the big problems with this is the person cannot change their mind because the document comes into force when you're considered incompetent. Therefore, whatever you wrote at that time, even if you're saying that, no, I don't want to die, they're going to kill you, okay? Well, with an advance directive, if you appoint, let's say, a son or a daughter who doesn't share your values, when you're incompetent, they're making decisions for you. And if they don't share your values, it's not a good thing. So whatever you do with your finances, so with your wills and your power of attorney over your finances, that's your business. But for your health care, choose someone who shares your values to the person you appoint. That's fundamental. We get calls all the time about this. You know, my oldest sister is the power of attorney and she's doing this and that. Sadly, they were given the power. It's hard to change that.
And adding in a little bit more context, specifically for the US, for anyone who may be tuning in from the US, very important to have the medical power of attorney. It needs to be a single cascading person, and it needs to be someone who shares your values. Of course, you do not want to have an advance directive because there are so many loopholes. As soon as they deem you incompetent, as soon as they, I've been involved in a situation where someone was told that persistent vegetative state was a spectrum diagnosis, and that the person who was sitting up requesting ice chips and water was in fact diagnosed with persistent vegetative state, and therefore the advance directive had come into play, and they were following that down the line. So very important to have a medical power of attorney and to choose well, but to be very, very careful about advance directives.
The other thing, so there was a question here along that line about the issue of will your document, your advance directive, be respected if if it says no to MAID? And the answer is that becomes a problem because the law was designed to make sure you have access to being killed. So therefore, even if you had an advance directive that said no to euthanasia, if you're actually then asking the doctor for it, even though your document said no, you were now saying yes. If the doctor were to assess you as being competent, then it would be taken as a clear request for euthanasia, and they would kill you anyway. Now, having a document in place saying that you didn't want it might allow us to sort of fight it in court a bit or something. But the problem is once you've been deemed competent, or once a doctor, let's say, deems you to be competent, then they could take that as a yes. Same thing here about the questions online about the issue of competence. It's a serious issue because obviously speaking, the law requires you to be competent before they can approve your death. But they changed the law with Bill C-7. So now they say that you had to be competent at the time of request. So just so you understand, when Bill C-7 was passed in March of 2021, we actually removed something in the original law that says the original law said you have to be competent at the time of death. So when they came in to kill you, you'd have to be competent then. You have to be capable of saying yes then. Now the law says you have to be competent at the time of request. So that means that if you request it and you were approved for it, and then let's say 8 days later, you had a stroke or something and you're having a hard time expressing yourself, they would be able to go ahead and kill you anyway, even if you were showing misgivings about it. Even if you maybe have changed your mind, it wouldn't matter because you were competent at the time of request. Therefore, it would continue on. This is a very difficult sort of thing, but that's how the law works. They're trying to make sure that you can have your death, right? It's the same sort of idea as the case of Joan Roway here in BC, who they were coming to the home to say, we're taking her away to get her made because we don't want you to deny her right to die. If you have any questions, email them to info@epcc.ca. Thank you very much.